In a world ravaged by secret societies, cults, and government corruption, a time where telling the truth has become a revolutionary act. The people cried out for answers, for justice. There were many who answered the call. Together, we are the Anti-Naughty. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Anti-Naughty podcast, a show where we interview different researchers who talk about the occult, esoteric, cults, and secret societies, all of the world of weird. Today, we have a brilliant researcher who's been running his own blog for the last decade. He writes extensive, well-sourced articles on everything in the world of weird. He's been looking at subjects including secret societies, cults, geopolitics, the occult, and I would say his true forte is the world of espionage. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome Recluse. Recluse, welcome to the Anti-Naughty.
Oh, thank you for having me here, Eric.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're one of the best at what you do, so I thought you'd be a great guest for this show. So let me just start by asking you, how did you get into this type of research?
Well, I mean, I kind of grew up in it. My dad, I would say, was certainly into some really, arcane theories, certainly from that era. I know one of his all-time favorite books, which I'm still in possession of his copy, was The Rich and the Super Rich. That was kind of an early pre-Carol Quigley attempt to chronicle the Eastern establishment. I mean, it's definitely rather dated at this point, but it does have some interesting stuff in it. I can remember, like listening to Bill Cooper with him, on the radio. I mean, back when we were visiting Colorado at some point in the earlier to mid '90s or something like that. So, I mean, my dad was definitely into a lot of that, and I think that sort of rubbed off on me, and it was something that definitely started to, have a great deal of interest to me going into the years following the Iraq invasion and what have you. Of course, my dad, to his credit, had actually been pretty opposed to everything Bush II was doing from the moment of 9/11 onward. It was, in hindsight, definitely got to give him some credit for that and seeing what a shit show it was.
Yeah, it seemed like everyone was on board, at least in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, for going into fighting this never-ending war on terror. But it sounds like you grew up with maybe a perspective that was questioning things already.
Yeah, well, I know I've gone over this in a couple of other interviews, but my dad had also been in the Army for a couple of years. I was told by my mom that he had been a Green Beret, but my mom has a tendency to embellish things, and based on what I've seen from service records, that does not appear to have been the case. But he definitely seems like he was in some kind of Army intelligence unit. He was in Greenland, which was a big listening facility. He had finished up his military career at Fort Meade, and my dad just absolutely despised the U.S. Army. I mean, I was definitely grown up with a lot of very negative stories recounting his experiences in the Army.
Mm-hmm. So you started Vice Up, your blog, about 10 years ago, it looks like. Were you doing it much before that, or was that your first foray into discussing these things on a public sphere?
Yeah, it was really my first foray. I mean, it had actually kind of ironically started out as kind of a paranormal investigation thing, and we were trying to do a website for it and what have you to get some of the material out. And I was like, well, there's a lot of these other topics, kind of conspiracy topics that I've been researching for some time now. So why don't I write on this to kind of fill up some of the space? And after a while, the paranormal thing petered out. I shouldn't say after a while. I mean, after a couple of months, but I mean, I
Mhm.
really liked, working on the blog and what have you. And from there, it kind of became the principal focus of the website, and the other kind of investigative stuff with supernatural things went to the wayside.
Yeah, yeah. Well, something I'd like to ask all of my guests is, as you start digging into all this crazy history and corruption that's going on in our world, it's hard to sort out actual good guys from bad guys. Do you have any favorite people in history that you think are true heroes of history?
uh, that was actually honestly the hardest question that you sent me. Uh, After years of researching all of this stuff, I am so incredibly jaded. It's very difficult for me to actually point to a historical figure that I would consider admiring. After thinking about it, I thought there was a recent US president that I kind of have some degree of respect for up to a certain point, and one who I think will probably surprise a lot of people. And that president was Richard Nixon.
Hmm.
And I know probably a lot of people are going to want me to explain it. So, okay, first off, to get into why I have a bit of a grudging respect for Nixon, it deals with the China lobby, the old China lobby. And I know that's probably not something that a lot of your readers are familiar with, so I'm going to give you a brief breakdown of that.
Sure.
So it essentially centered around a political party, the Chinese National Party, I think it's pronounced Kuomintang, but so I'm not continuously butchering this. We're just going to refer to it as the KMT from here on out. So those are the
Mhm.
abbreviations for it. The KMT was the Nationalist Party in mainland China, and it eventually become headed by Chiang Kai-shek, I believe around the late 20s, early 30s, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. And the KMT was in many ways essentially the Israeli lobby of its era from roughly the 1930s up to the early 1970s. It was just profoundly corrupt. And Chiang Kai shek and most of the other high party officials were deeply, deeply immersed in drug trafficking. And this was a fact that was exposed somewhat in the late 60s, early 70s during the Vietnam conflict by researchers like Alfred McCoy and what have you. And this kind of flew in the face of what had been the quote unquote conventional wisdom concerning the heroin trafficking up to that point, which was that, namely, it was under the control of the Communist Chinese, the PRC, the People's Republic of China. Um, and it kind of seems like now, with the benefit of hindsight, essentially both sides were correct. The Communist Chinese were working in conjunction with the Nationalist Chinese. The basis for the opium, the poppies were grown in China. They were transferred across, I think eventually it was to Laos or Burma. I can't remember which off the top of my head. And there, the KMT guys took possession of them. I'm not sure if they paid the Communist Chinese there, if the Communist Chinese got a cut. But effectively, they were shipping all this opium to the West, which led to the heroin epidemic that really started to grip the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. Of course, it really, was not that bad compared to what we're currently undergoing with the opioid epidemic today, but
Mhm.
it was the first time that there had really been large scale drug abuse in the United States in the post war years. And, it had started to have a rather deliberating effect. And then on top of that, you had the so called French connection, the Sicilian Mafia, probably not pronouncing that correctly, but these were the big French drug traffickers. And they also seem to have been essentially playing both sides, were communist Chinese and what have you, also to make profits off of this. And Nixon, the China lobby had primarily backed the Republicans in the United States for years, and Nixon was very much a part of this network. He had come to power with a lot of help from the China lobby. He very much had an insider's perspective into this, and as such, I imagine this is how he came to the conclusion that the China lobby had to be destroyed. It just, like I said, it was really very much the Israeli lobby of its day. It really thoroughly compromised a lot of politicians and other individuals in the United States, and it was just knee deep in organized crime, drug trafficking, all a bunch of unsavory things. And on top of that, I mean, after the nationalist Chinese had lost the civil war with the communists, they had essentially gone to Formosa and taken it over and renamed it Taiwan. You don't really hear about this a lot, but Taiwan is essentially an apartheid country. To this day, most of the wealth in the country is controlled by the nationalist Chinese, who are only about 10% of the population. The
Mhm.
Formosians were exploited for years there. I think it was just recently the current prime minister, I don't know if she's still in power or not, but she was the first individual in Taiwan who actually was, ethnically Formosian to hold power in this country, and she was only a Formosian. I mean, her one side of her family were all Chinese, and one of her, I think, paternal grandfather was Chinese on the other side. So, they had been exploited for many years here. So, getting back to Nixon, he understood the corruption of the KMT, and I think this really underscored a lot of his foreign policy decisions going into the early 70s, first to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China, which also ultimately proved to be an absolutely brilliant foreign policy decision in terms of the Cold War and, neutralizing the Soviet influence there. But on top of that, it was essentially, I think, to put the KMT and the communist Chinese in competition with one another, whereas previously they had essentially been working in collaboration to exploit the West. And then on the same token, he really went all out to finally destroy the French connection and the opium traffic that was being facilitated by the KMT. And it was really done in a very unsavory manner. I mean, there's no way to, sugarcoat it. He essentially set up a death squad in the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, and they went all over the world and basically killed all of these French gangsters in a pretty,
Mm.
mass amount of bodies that were left in their wake. And I mean, it was a horrible precedent. There's no question about that. But I mean, on the flip side of the coin, I mean, I can kind of understand Nixon's perspective in this. Of course, there had been an attempt to prosecute the French Connection a few years earlier in 1968, and that was just a disaster. Of course, they made the movie about that, which was called The French Connection. The cop who had headed this whole thing was a guy named, I think it was Popeye Doyle. He was the guy that Gene Hackman had played in The French Connection. He was nicknamed Popeye because he was so perpetually strung out on amphetamines that he was always bug-eyed whenever his fellow officers saw him, and that was where he got the name Popeye from. So this was the kind of guy that you had trying to crack down on international heroin traffic. It was, absurd. And unsurprisingly, I mean, aside from maybe a few minor French gangsters being arrested, nobody made him brought down. I think something like two-thirds of the heroin that the police department confiscated ended up missing the evidence log, essentially. So,
Mm.
yeah, legal means have been tried, they failed. And I think from Nixon's perspective, essentially, a choice of turning back to the whole thing, just letting it go on like every president prior to him had done, or kill them. And he opted for the latter. And as I said before, it was an absolutely terrible precedent. But on the flip side of the coin, it does kind of bring up the dilemma that you face, consider these complex geopolitical situations and what exactly can be done. The China lobby had certainly become a major problem for the United States at many levels, as had their associates in the mafia, and the government was so compromised with all the money that was coming in from these dollars that it would have been almost impossible to push channels to stop this corruption. So Nixon's response was basically to turn around and just start killing people. And again, it's a horrible precedent, but it does bring up a lot of the complexities and problems as dealing with these type of geopolitical situations. And that's why I have something of a grudging admiration for Nixon. I mean, he did, I shouldn't say admiration, respect, because if anything else, I mean, studying his regime and the problems that he had, it kind of highlighted these complexities. And I mean, the question of what actually can be done. And I
Mhm.
don't think Nixon made the best decisions that he could have made, but unlike a lot of other presidents, he tried. And, that's something I suppose that we could at least be thankful to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite tough to find like a pure hero of history. You know, sometimes we do have to look at these complicated figures, and they were dealing with, you know, extreme corruption, and sometimes the means to deal with that isn't very pretty. Um, yeah, so, so it's an interesting take on Nixon, certainly. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, he's usually depicted as just, an antichrist, essentially by, most historians. But yeah, I mean, especially in the context of some of the presidents that followed him, he really was not that bad, people. I know you've heard a lot of, things about him. Again, I'm not trying to say that he was necessarily a good president, and some of the things that he set up drugs have just been absolutely horrendous for this country. But I don't know that that was Nixon's intention when he necessarily set these programs up in the first place in the 60s, the late 60s, the early 70s. It was really the Reagan and Bush crew that really militarized the war on drugs, turned it into what it is today. And when you get into those, regimes, Reagan, both of the Bushes, the Clintons, this is when you really start to see some, truly morally bankrupt figures on any number of levels.
mhm. Yeah. Well, let's shift gears here a little bit. I would like to talk about the Epstein case. Now, you recently had an interview on the Higher Side Chats where you went quite in depth on Epstein, so I don't necessarily want to rehash what you just did on that interview, but I would like to ask you a little bit about it and the connections. Um, and just to start off, what do you think are some of the most important aspects of the Epstein case that not everyone necessarily knows about?
Well, for me, the big thing that I've been kind of highlighting is the British connection and the links that it really seems to have to this old, intelligence network that really went back even before the Second World War to kind of some of these Anglo-American fellowship networks like the Room and so forth. And I really think that this is important because it illustrates just how long this, kind of rot has been present in the body politics. And it's something that I definitely am getting a sense that the mainstream media is trying to shift focus away from. Certainly when you start seeing even accounts that try to bring up intelligence connections to the Maxwell family, for instance, it's usually an emphasis on the Israelis and the Russians. And
Hmm.
it's not to say that they're not players in all of this on some level or not, but I definitely think the British angle has been, kind of covertly overlooked by a lot of sources in this matter.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you mentioned the Maxwell family, and some people may have heard of Ghislaine Maxwell, but I don't think everybody realizes just how connected that the Maxwells are. So, could you tell the audience who Robert Maxwell was?
Robert Maxwell was, of course, your father, the famous publisher who had owned the Mirror Group in the UK. He had also had shares in MTV in Central Europe. He had bought out I believe it was the New York Daily Post shortly before his death in the early 90s. But Maxwell appears to have had a decade-spanning relationship with various intelligence services, and this really went back, again, like many of these things, to the Second World War. Initially, Maxwell, he had been born in the area now that would be kind of Czechoslovakia. He had fled this from the Nazis and what have you. A lot of his family ended up dying in the Holocaust, and eventually he had ended up in the UK, where he had joined the British Army and had served with distinction. Eventually, he'd achieved the rank of captain. But for Maxwell, things really started to get going after the war ended, and that was when he started to be used by British intelligence. Initially, his handler was George Kennedy Young, who was a rather infamous MI6 officer. He would later go on to play a major role in the coup in Iran during the early 50s, 1952-53 period. But Kennedy Young at the time was stationed in Austria, and Austria was just a major mecca for early Cold War intrigues. The British, of course, used it as the base of operations to infiltrate a lot of agents into Eastern Europe to kind of keep an eye on what the Soviets were up to. And Maxwell was brought in as to assist with interrogations. Of course, he was fluent in multiple languages, so he was very useful in this capacity. And it seems like from there, he also came into contact with the predecessor to the KGB. I'm not sure which one it was at this point in time, but what eventually became the KGB. He came into contact with some of these agents, around 46, 47, and this relationship would be cultivated more so in the 50s. And then at the same time, the British, and specifically Sir Charles Hambro, who was just a pivotal figure in the British establishment. He had been a director of the Bank of England when he was only 30 years old. He was the head of the Hambro Bank, which was one of the major financial institutions in the UK for most of the 20th century. It was up there with Barclays and Rothschilds and the other revered and legendary banking houses. And he was the one who had set Maxwell up with his first publisher in, I believe it was either the late 40s or the early 50s. I can't remember which now off the top of my head, but it was a pretty substantial loan, something like £25,000, which was, no meager sum of money in this time frame when the, Britain was very destitute financially. And this is the funds that Maxwell used to establish what eventually became Pergamon Press, which was his first publisher and his the publisher that really specialized in scientific journals and so forth. And Maxwell really scored a major coup in 1954 when he traveled to the Soviet Union and he met with the KGB officials, and he was essentially granted access to Soviet scientific publications and the scientists themselves and so forth. And this is, in a sense, what the British had originally intended for Maxwell to do. Their interest in Maxwell was driven primarily by scientific intelligence gathering and wanting to keep an eye on what the Soviets were up to. But I think for Maxwell, though, he was able to effectively set himself up during this time frame as a back channel, more or less, between the UK and the Soviets, because the British were aware that he was in contact with the KGB, going back to the time when he made contact with them in Moscow in 1954. And the Soviets were certainly aware of his contacts with the, with British intelligence. And I think, to my mind, the most plausible explanation for how Maxwell was able to operate with the support of both of these intelligence services for so long is essentially because he was useful. He was effectively a back channel between the two, and this was a role that he probably continued well into the Thatcher era and probably up to the time of his death. And to kind of, add some intrigues into this, Hambro had been specifically interested in nuclear espionage. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the UK did not have the nuclear bomb, and the United States had started to, really curtail the amount of scientific information we were sharing with them at this point in time. The Russians had gotten it in 1949, I think, and part of me wonders if Maxwell might have potentially been maybe trying to get some degree of nuclear technology from the Russians for the UK, and maybe in exchange for some of the other technology that the British were sitting on that was still, quite good from the World War II era. Certainly, Britain had become rather obsessed with becoming a nuclear power in its own right to, try to maintain some degree of independence from the United States. And Maxwell, with his contacts within the scientific community in the Soviet Union, may well have been an ideal individual to facilitate some kind of transfer if such a thing did happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's it's truly shocking, all the things you list off there. I mean, Robert Maxwell was clearly connected to so many intelligence apparatuses and seemed to have been used to create sort of propaganda institutions. Did you see this photograph that came out of his daughter Ghislaine sitting in In-N-Out Burger, and she's just sitting there reading a book called the Book of Honor: The Secret Lives and Deaths of CIA Operatives. It was a really weird photo that came out.
Yeah, I did see that. And if I'm not mistaken, I think she had actually reviewed the book on Amazon or something to that effect, maybe a year or two beforehand. So it's actually possible that she had already read it. That kind of makes me think that it was a delivered photo op, essentially, kind of a little bit of a limited hangout, maybe on her part, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah, it seemed very odd. It seems just like a wink at the world of kind of all the connections that these people have. Now you have a very interesting series of articles that kind of digs into uh, mob and intelligence ties, and you get into so many different figures. It can be quite difficult to keep track of all of these people and organizations. Tell us a little bit about what Resorts International was and its security agency, Intertel.
Well, Resorts International was a gaming concern. It had its origins in a company that was set up in the early 60s called the Mary Carter Paint Company. And one of the initial backers of it was Thomas Dewey, who had been a presidential candidate for the Republicans in 48. He might have even been in 44 too. I can't remember, but he was very close to the Dulles brothers, and there is compelling evidence that Mary Carter, in turn, had been a kind of CIA front that had contributed into the run up to the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then the anti-Castro Cuban activities that had kind of proceeded in the aftermath of that for several years. And then in the late 60s, you saw a lot of people from, Mayor Lansky's kind of faction of the syndicate moving in, and it really turned into a gaming concern for the syndicate. It set up a casino in Paradise Island on the Bahamas, and this also sort of led to the beginning of the kind of offshoring culture that started there. Because Resorts was also, or the Paradise Island casino was also used to launder a lot of money for the
Mm-hmm.
syndicate during this era, and it brought a lot of interesting figures into the fold. Of course, Richard Nixon himself, ironically, was actually present at the opening of the casino at Paradise Island in 1968. And another early backer of Resorts was Richard Mellon Hitchcock, the acid financier. He had been a sponsor of Timothy Leary and then the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. He had really done a lot to, spread LSD in the United States in the 60s. And then prior to that, he had also played a role in the Profumo scandal, which I've kind of gone over a lot, really links up to the Epstein flap and what have you. And then there was Intertel, their in-house intelligence agency, which had been set up by Robert Peliquin, I believe, who had been a former official in the Justice Department. They got a lot of other, FBI men and such like in it. And Intertel was really one of the first kind of private intelligence setups. I mean, really a corporate structure to it and what have you. It was engaged in a lot of intrigues, and this led potentially to the abduction of Howard Hughes in Las Vegas in the early 70s. Hughes, of course, had eventually taken over some aspects of Resorts, and the whole situation was bizarre. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Mayhew had alleged that he was abducted. The Intertel people essentially claimed that he was being held captive in Las Vegas by Mayhew, and that they were rescuing him. But whatever the case may be, he was essentially sheltered away by Intertel, and only a handful of people even saw him live in the 70s after he was taken out of Las Vegas. So there has been some speculation when exactly he died, and Intertel maybe been keeping the myth of Hughes alive for several years after the body had expired. Who really knows? But it was definitely a curious institution, to put it mildly.
Yeah. And even the name Intertel is just it's another one of those cases where it just seems like they're mocking the public and just kind of like, yeah, we have our own intelligence agency tied to tied to all this. It's very odd. Now you mentioned Mayhew, and he's got tied to all sorts of things, including Project Artichoke, which was kind of a precursor to MK Ultra, and he was involved in honey traps. This kind of sexual blackmail scandals that they use to control people. Tell us a bit about Mayhew and how he ties into this.
Well, Mayhew had started out working for the FBI in the 40s and so forth. There, he had actually encountered several other FBI agents who would eventually become key CIA figures, like James McCord, who was involved in the Watergate flap, and William Harvey, who some have speculated was the man who essentially was tasked with a lot of the CIA's assassination programs in the late 50s and early 60s. But Mayhew had eventually left the bureau, and after a few years of, I think he tried to run like a dairy farm or something to that effect. He had reestablished himself as a private detective, and not long afterwards, he was essentially recruited by the CIA's Office of Security as a contract agent. And the OS is a very, very enigmatic part of the CIA. It doesn't get a lot of press. in comparison to, say, the Directorate of Plans or some of the other components like Angleton's counterintelligence staff and so forth. But the OS, it really was at the center of a lot of black projects that the CIA was involved in throughout the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. Its composition also was a lot different than most of the mainline CIA. Most of the OS men were former FBI or military men. They didn't have the same Office of Strategic Services connections as a lot of the hierarchy of the CIA, and this had led to some kind of bad blood between the two factions at times. I've been told that essentially the OS men kind of viewed the OSS men kind of viewed the Office of Security personnel as kind of knuckle dragging Neanderthals, and the Office of Security men kind of viewed the OSS men as closet homosexuals and communist sympathizers. So, yeah, these two factions, there wasn't really a lot of love lost between them. And the OS was also the component of the CIA that initially oversaw a lot of the assassination projects against Castro and probably a lot of other domestic operations. And the reason being for that is because of the FBI connection. A lot of these guys had impeccable contacts with the syndicate, with various organized crime outfits. And a lot of times, if the CIA wanted to kill somebody domestically, the mob was a good selection for this. The mob obviously knows a thing or two about killing people. It's discreet, and it can easily be explained away as some kind of gangland thing. So the OS, because of their connections, seem to have been at the lead point of this. And then on top of that, the OS was also the component of the CIA that oversaw Artichoke. And Artichoke was not necessarily a predecessor to MK Ultra. In fact, it actually continued to run concurrently with MK Ultra up until the early 60s, and then it had various sub projects that continued up to the early 70s when all of this stuff was shut down because of the church committee and so forth. But
Mhm.
Artichoke was never under the control of Sidney Gottlieb, as is often depicted. It was always under the control of the Office of Security and not the technical services staff. It was a separate program, and there was definitely a bit of a rivalry with the MK Ultra people in that sense. But yes, I mean the OS was really big in a lot of this kind of stuff, and then also kind of getting into I think what you were indicating, there was also the whole component of sexual blackmail. Essentially, the OS had set up a series of safe houses both in the United States and across Europe and so forth. And a lot of these safe houses were used for legitimate purposes, just stashing defectors in and things of that nature. But at some point in the late 40s, early 50s, they did start to use some of these safe houses to entertain VIPs and so forth in with call girls, and they were outfitted with surveillance equipment and what have you. And this eventually it also led to some of the experimentation with the artichoke, drugs and so forth at these safe houses, and that kind of laid the foundation for the MK Ultra project. What was it, Midnight Climax or something like that,
Yeah, that's
that had
right.
been overseen by George Hunter White. White had actually started out working with the OS in some of these safe houses, and probably he took the knowledge that he had gleaned from that to set up the MK Ultra program.
Hmm. Very interesting. So yeah, we do have this like long history of intelligence, tied up with using sexual blackmail, and among other things. So the Epstein case is nothing new in that regard. Now, something very interesting that I read about in one of your articles was the promise system. What was promise?
Well, Promise was developed in the late 70s. I think it was initially done under a government contract, and then it was the technology was essentially sold to one of the proprietors, and he founded Inslaw, the company that had ultimately developed Promise for the Department of Justice. And this was, of course, at the late 70s, the early 80s, when things were first starting to be, digital, transferred to computers and so forth. And Promise was almost, I suppose, in a sense, a kind of proto search engine in some senses for the Department of Justice. Basically, you would transfer all of these files that they had sitting around onto a computer database, and then you could search through everything. And this was, a major revolution in the early 80s. Of course, previously, you would have had to have people scurrying through files and what have you for hours, and now you could essentially do a search for keywords in just a matter of minutes.
Mhm.
And this obviously it had a lot of appeal to intelligence agencies because this software would eventually be sold to a lot of different banks and so forth. I mean, it had, a lot of value to institutions besides the Department of Justice, obviously. And the CIA had gone out and asserted a back door into this so they could essentially keep track of the files, that were in this database. And this was a great way, for instance, to keep track of drug smugglers. You could see where their money was being transferred in bank accounts and what have you. And the Israelis also ended up stealing a version of Promise as well, and they inserted their own backdoor into it. The guy that was tapped essentially to sell the Israeli enhanced version of Promise was Bob Maxwell. He had sold it to a lot of the regimes in the Soviet satellites. He had sold it to a lot of regimes in Africa. He had sold it to some of the various Commonwealth countries like Australia and New Zealand. Curiously, I don't think he sold it to the British government though, which is interesting.
Mhm.
But he did end up selling it to institutions in the United States, the most famous of which was Los Alamos. This was, of course, where a lot of our nuclear secrets were housed, specifically in the Sandia laboratory, I believe, in New Mexico. And essentially, by setting up the Promise software there, he was able to enable the Israelis to steal a lot of the U.S.'s nuclear secrets from the Los Alamos facilities during the 1980s. So you
Mhm.
kind of see this continuation of, Bob Maxwell and his expertise in scientific espionage.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting piece of the history of espionage because it really shows us how technology has been, used from very early on to not, to be a surveillance system essentially since the very beginning. Promise is an interesting part of this. Um, Now you mentioned you get into Ghislaine's Maxwell's connections a bit. After her father, she continued in the same line of work. There was a party that she had, I believe, on a yacht in 1989 that had some interesting figures involved. What was the significance of this party?
Well, it was actually Robert Maxwell was
Oh, it
who
was
threw
his
in the
party.
party, and it was on. Yeah, it was his party, and it was on his yacht, which was actually named Lane too, after his daughter. She was, of course, present. There were a lot of other, kind of unsavory figures that were present there as well, including Donald Trump himself. Roy Cohn's a former law partner. I think it was Tom Bauer now, Bolin maybe. I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but Cohn was, of course, Trump's political mentor slash longtime attorney. Cohn has himself been linked to a lot of these, entrapment operations and what have you. There's been a lot of speculation that he was one of the principal blackmail specialists in New York City for many years, and there's certainly compelling evidence to indicate that this was in fact the case. So his former law partner was there. Another guy present who's kind of interesting was John Tower, a former Republican senator who was Bob Maxwell's essentially primary Washington lobbyist. He was actually the guy who had arranged for Maxwell to approach Los Alamos initially to sell them the enhanced promise software. So Tower had a lot of mojo within these kind of inner circles. So, these were definitely some very well connected people that she was meeting at this party. And this kind of brings up the possibility of whether or not this was maybe an effort to maybe bring her into some of these entrapment operations. Of course, Trump officially had met Jeffrey Epstein, I believe, about 2 years earlier in 1987, and Ghislaine would meet Epstein in, I think it was 92 or something like that, and it was essentially at a party that Trump was at, and Trump was, I believe, the one who had actually encouraged Epstein to get Ghislaine's number or something to that effect and call her back. I can't remember the exact details, but
Hmm.
Trump was very close to all these facilities. And then I've also seen recently that Epstein previously had also known Roy Cohn himself. I haven't been able to reliably confirm this yet, but Cohn and Epstein both shared a similar friend in Barbara Walters. Cohn actually had used Barbara Walters as his date for a lot of, black tie functions and things like that. So definitely there is a good possibility that there was some kind of connection between these men. So it's, definitely an interesting kind of chain of events. Epstein potentially meets Cohn in the early to mid 80s. It would have to be in this time frame because Cohn died in, I think it was 86 or so, maybe 87. And then from this point going onward, he meets Trump around 87. 2 years later, Trump encounters Ghislaine at this party that her father threw. And then a few years after that, Trump. You there?
Yeah, I just killed my mic for a second because of a train.
Oh, okay, okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. All right. So yeah, basically, a couple of years later, they meet each other at this party. So I mean, it's definitely a rather interesting kind of chain of events here.
And yeah, it starts to show Trump's ties to all of these things. Trump is tied to all sorts of shady individuals, especially when you look at Trump Tower. There's a lot of interesting connections there. Could you get into some of the mob ties with mob and intelligence ties with Trump Tower?
Well, definitely the mob ties were quite, substantial. I mean, the five families of New York had ties to that. I mean, even in the building process, one of the guys who had procured the concrete for it was Biff Halloran, who was a big guy in the Genovese crime family, and who would ironically also end up having a lot of dealings with the company, which was based out of Kentucky. This was essentially a drug and arms trafficking network that was comprised of a lot of former military and police officers. Halloran was kind of a business partner with one of the founders of the company for a time, and he seems to have steered a lot of their early clientele to them. Trump was also active in Kentucky a lot during this time, so I mean, you kind of get some interesting connections there. But there were also, of course, the Russian mob connections, which went back to at least the mid 80s. One of the guys was a guy named David Bagatin, I think is how his name was pronounced. But he had taken out an apartment, I believe, in Trump Tower in 1984 or so, and had started to set up a racket there. And of course, this guy was involved with Simeon Mogilevich, who's kind of considered to be the boss of the Russian mafia. And of course, Simeon Mogilevich was also the guy that Robert Maxwell would eventually forge a partnership around roughly the same time. In fact, of course, the time frame of this is really interesting because I mean Trump hooks up with the Russian mafia in '84, and then Maxwell seems to have contacts with it in '85, essentially through the same syndicate, within the Russian mafia. So that's kind of illustrative. And then continuing on, there were multiple Russian mobsters who would continue to use the Trump Tower up until really the recent era. So that was quite interesting. And then I suppose for intelligence, you had the kind of now kind of infamous Trump Tower meeting that took place there in 2016 between Eric Trump and Paul Manafort on the one side, and the Russian attorney Natalie. Gosh, I don't even want to try to pronounce her last name, man. I forgot to look that one up, and yeah,
That's
I
fine.
know I'm going to butcher that one. But that whole thing was bizarre because this Russian attorney at the same time had just met Glenn Simpson, the founder of Fusion GPS, which was the private intelligence firm that produced the Steele dossier morning before the Trump Tower meeting. So then, after meeting him, she goes and has the meeting at Trump Tower. And the whole thing it's very curious because Fusion GPS, on one hand, had been employed to drag up opposition research against Trump, and that had led Steele dossier, which essentially had tried to depict Trump as being a patsy of the Russians. But at the same time, Fusion GPS was also trying to dig up dirt on Bill Browder, who had been one of the chief figures advocating financial sanctions against the Russian Federation, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. And reportedly, that was the actual purpose of the Trump Tower meeting, the discussion to try to get some of these sanctions lifted. So, yeah, it's a really strange thing where you have Fusion GPS essentially working for the Russians against Browder, and then theoretically working against the Russians and dragging up, dirt on Trump with the whole Steele
Hmm.
dossier and asking.
Yeah. There are an abundance of strange connections, and it can be difficult to sort it all out. Um, Something I had noticed a while back was that R. Kelly seemed to be running his sex cult out of Trump Tower, and I didn't think too much of it at the time. But when I started looking into your work a bit more, it got me thinking about it again. Have you looked into R. Kelly and Do you think there's anything going on there between him and Trump?
No, I hadn't looked into that. I had not at all realized it was in Trump Tower until you had mentioned that in the email, which I haven't really had a chance to look into that, but it is certainly interesting. I mean, with in hindsight of some of the other things, that are
Mhm.
connected to Trump, certainly, I'm definitely going to look into it now that it was brought to my attention. But yeah, I don't really have anything for you right now other than just baseless speculation,
Right.
essentially, which is usually not the best thing.
Yeah, it just seemed interesting considering all the shady figures involved at the tower and Trump's Epstein's connections, obviously. Um, so speaking of Trump, there are many people in the kind of truther community or in the conspiracy realm that seem to think that Trump is a hero who is leading the charge against all government corruption and the deep state. And I find this a rather laughable perspective. And I'd like to hear what do you think is the most damning evidence of Trump that shows that he's not really just heroic figure that people view him as?
Well, I mean, I would just say generally just the connections he has to Cohn and Epstein. I mean, Roy Cohn was just a horrendous figure on any number of levels. I mean, any sensible person, I mean, with any degree of morality, would not want to be associated with Roy Cohn, to say nothing of being mentored by him. And Epstein, I mean, Trump knew Epstein since 1987. I mean, some of the women for his sex ring recruited at Mar-a-Lago, and Trump is fanatical about security. I mean, he was spending a fortune on his own private security attachments going back to the late 80s. And that's probably one of the big reasons why he's continued to use his own security personnel instead of the Secret Service in recent years. I mean, he has a very professional and very well paid team. So to me, it's ludicrous to suggest that he didn't have some idea about what Epstein was doing
Mm-hmm.
until what was it, 2007 or something like that, when he finally kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago after the charges started to come up. It's ridiculous. It's
Yeah.
absurd. And yes, I don't know how many responses I've gotten from people after I've tried to outline these connections to Roy Cohn and Epstein, and they're like, "No, this is all really, quite plausible, but thank God he was elected instead of the Clintons. That would have just been unbearable." It's like, it's like, dude, the Clintons, I mean, they're pretty evil in their own right, but I mean, the whole
Hmm.
network behind Trump, I mean, in a lot of ways, make the Clintons look like choir boys to some extent, choir girls, if you will, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, starting to move on to a new topic here. Let's get into cults and secret societies. That's another aspect of work that you've done a lot on. And just a pretty general question in terms of smaller cults, what we generally think of as cults, there often seem to be strange intelligence ties. It's a lot of weird connections with some of these cults. What do you think is going on with that? Do you think intelligence agencies are actually getting involved with and potentially creating some of the smaller cults we see?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes into like what type of culture really talking about. But certainly I do think so. And I mean, in the case of when you get into some of these, Christian networks, which is really more my area of expertise, one of the more bizarre of these outfits is a group that was variously known as the Sovereign Order of St. John or the Shiksheni Knights of Malta, something to that effect. But they were a pseudo outfit that was essentially claimed descent from the Knights of Malta, but there's obviously a lot of dispute about that. In theory, it was their line of descent came from the Russian connection. The Knights of Malta briefly relocated to Russia in the early 19th century, and then in theory, the members from the Russian branch immigrated to the United States in the early 20th century, and they had eventually set up the SOSJ. Uh, at some point in the 19 teens, the 20s, something to that effect. But the evidence for this is a bit debatable, though there were some kind of predecessors to it. But the real Shiksheni Knights of Malta got going in the 1950s, and this whole outfit seems to have been used to spread a lot of Christian identity theology, quote unquote. For those of you who aren't aware, this is a profoundly racist ideology that essentially depicts white Europeans as the actual Jews of the Bible, God's chosen people. The actual Jews themselves are satanic, non-human beings, and the same could be applied to most other non-white people. That's a rather simplistic take on it, but I find the whole ideology to be quite vile, and I really do not want to discuss it in depth. So, yes, it was very disgusting, and it really played into a lot of the militia movement and some of these, other right-wing groups. Of course, a lot of the sovereign citizen ideology was also promoted by the SOSJ, and this effectively created a very proficient terrorist organization related by sovereign citizen ideology and Christian identity theology and so forth. You can find connections to this, network going back to bombings of African American churches in the late 50s, to the MLK assassination, to Oklahoma City, to the outrages of the order, and so forth. It definitely seems like this was a very elaborate terror network that had operated in the United States for decades. It may well still be going in some capacity. The last really major figure was Israeli Keys, the serial killer that had been arrested a few years ago. But in this case, it definitely seems like, as to why something like this would have been created. Well, it provided a fertile ground to recruit individuals for some of these more extreme projects that were being dreamed up, in the United States by some of these right-wing groups. It was definitely a very insidious thing, to put it mildly. And I mean, this is just one potential purpose you could point to. I mean, another would obviously be spiritual manipulation, I would say, of the populace as large. This was probably one of the factors behind some of the cults that helped establish the New Age movement, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And then, within Christianity itself, you could also point to the moral rearmament movement of Frank Buchman, I believe, that had emerged in the 1930s. This underpinned, the Unification Church, for instance, and some of these other, really militant sects of Christianity that, in a sense, I think really weaponized it for the Cold War and the struggle that the, I mean, people in the intelligence community foresaw with the Russians. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, interesting connections to this, and I mean, definitely the use of cults, there's a lot of different ways that they could be used by intelligence agencies for different purposes. Sometimes, I mean, a lot of it was probably related to special operations, though essentially whether it was propagandistic or whether it was paramilitary or related to assassinations and so forth. But cults, because of their, secretive nature and so forth, would have been ideal for some of these types of operations, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, another a group that you've done really extensive research into, and that you mentioned briefly, is the Knights of Malta. That Knights of John organization kind of claims to be a spin-off of this. What is the Knights of Malta itself? How would you define that organization?
Well, I mean, it's essentially, I mean, I would say probably for many years it was effectively the paramilitary arm of the Vatican, going back to, the Crusader times when it was the Nice Hospitallers. From there, after they were driven out of the Holy Land, they really became the preeminent naval power in the Mediterranean for many centuries and were instrumental in facilitating trade there. And then after the loss of Malta, they essentially seem to have you reconstituted themselves as kind of an intelligence network that appears in a lot of these, kind of unsavory special operations in the 20th century. I mean, in Europe, you have something kind of similar to what the SOSJ network was being used for in the United States with the stay behind armies and so forth, which the Knights of Malta appear to have been instrumental in setting up. And I should probably clarify, when I'm talking about the stay behind networks, this is essentially what most people refer thinking of when they refer to Gladio. Gladio, though, was only actually the Italian component of the network. We don't really know what the European-wide network was actually called. For the sake of brevity, though, I'm just going to refer to it as the stay-behind networks. But these were basically shadow paramilitary organizations that were set up in almost all of the Western European countries. And the theory was, if the Soviet Union invaded Europe, they would be used to wage a guerrilla war against them, though in actuality, they were essentially used in most cases to destabilize Western European governments to ensure that they stayed within the sphere of the United States and the UK during the Cold War struggle. And definitely the Knights of Malta were at the forefront of this, vast network. So, I mean, it seems that this kind of paramilitary tradition that the Knights of Malta at first, embraced going back to the Holy Land was still, quite present going into the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, now, John J. Robinson, in his book Born in Blood, he goes over kind of how he believes that the Knights Templar, they went underground and eventually turned into what we now know as Freemasonry. And he points to the peasant revolts and how it seems like uh, kind of the underground Templars took advantage of the peasant revolts and tried to guide them against their enemies. And the Knights Hospitaller were actually quite a target of these revolts. Have you looked into this at all? And what do you think of his theory that the Knights Templar and Freemasons are connected?
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with Born in Blood, and I definitely think it's plausible. I'm not going to say it's, definitively proven or anything by that nature, but certainly I will say this, though. There are a lot of Masons and other affiliated secret societies that do genuinely believe that the Freemasons are the successors to the Knights Templar, and that definitely seems to underpin a lot of the ideology of these groups.
Mm-hmm. Um, no, another interesting organization that kind of ties in with the Knights of Malta, and sometimes they seem to be at odds, but other times perhaps working together, is Opus Dei. How would you define Opus Dei and its relation to the Knights of Malta?
Well, Opus Dei wasn't. I mean, unlike the Knights of Malta, which were, an order of knighthood, obviously, Opus Dei wasn't necessarily founded to be that, though, from what I understand, the founder actually did have that as kind of a hidden agenda or so forth. But like the Knights of Malta and the Jesuits, I mean, they also seem to have worked as kind of an intelligence network for the Vatican at various times. And of course, the relationship between the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei hasn't always been, the best. I think at one point Opus Dei had even tried to co-opt the Knights of Malta, which the former didn't really appreciate that much.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, they've worked in conjunction. They had kind of a loose alliance as they were, at the forefront of the really reactionary side of the Vatican hierarchy, along with, the Legion of Christ and, some of these other organizations. And they were typically in opposition to the Jesuits, despite the fact that you usually see a lot of these groups, being depicted as working in hand with one another. Of course, the Jesuits themselves weren't exactly the most progressive organization on the face of the earth either, but going into the Cold War, there was a lot of ideological disputes between these two factions, especially over the notion of liberation theology and the Third World.
Mm-hmm. Um, Now, something that like all of these organizations seem to use in their symbolism, and something I haven't really figured out yet, is that they always use Saint John, or actually both Johns, from the Bible in their symbolism. Do you know why that is? Why these figures are so important in these kind of Christian cult?
Well, I think as far as St. John the Baptist is concerned, I don't really know about the other St. John, but as far as the Baptist is concerned, I think it's the headless symbolism that really appeals to them. I have certainly wondered if the obsession with St. John and a lot of symbolism of St. John might be a reference to some extent to the what was it, the bornless one right, or the right of the headless one, that kind of passed down in Western esoteric traditions from Egypt, going into the ancient world. Essentially, the bornless rite was kind of an exorcism, if you will, though it's been interpreted in a lot of different senses. I'm obviously not an authority on this, but I mean, it did make quite a heavy use of the symbolism of the headless one as well, the whole notion of the decapitated head. So I have kind of wondered if, the presence of the of St. John the Baptist, and a lot of this is a kind of tip of the hat to that. And of course, there
Hmm.
was the long-standing allegations that the Knights Templar did possess the head of St. John the Baptist. So, I mean, maybe it was kind of a subtle reference. We don't have an actual physical head, but maybe we've discovered some of this rites of the Bornless One that we had incorporated into our cosmology. I don't know, but I definitely think there's some kind of connection to this with St. John and then the rite of the Bornless One, definitely.
Hmm. Yeah, and the term Baphomet is that like that's one of the theories on that term is that it's referring to the severed head of Saint John. So it's yeah, but it's hard to figure out what's all going on with that. But that's an interesting uh, connection you bring up with Egypt. Um, Now you mentioned Operation Gladio briefly, which was a portion of these intelligence leave behind operations, stay behind operations. What does propaganda do? This the name of this. I think is quite shocking. What is this?
Well, it was a Masonic lodge, and there were actually a couple of these. There was P2, the one you're talking about, which was in Italy. There was P1 in France, P3 in Spain. I believe there was a P7 in Belgium. But essentially, this was a network of Masonic lodges that had been set up by the U.S. intelligence community and probably the Vatican as well in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it seems that it was a kind of control body for the governments of these various Western European nations. And in the case of P2 in Italy, the Grand Master Licio Gelli had essentially required potential initiates to turn over compromising material that they had both on themselves and people that they knew to him as part of being brought into P2. And this essentially meant that now everybody in the lodge, is blackmailable by the Grand
Mhm.
Master. And I mean, the people in the lodge, these were all high-ranking figures in finance, in industry, in the intelligence community, and control of these files as such would essentially give one control over the Italian government itself. And of course, we don't know as much about the other propaganda lodges in the other countries, but I'm guessing something similar to that effect was what was used. Of course, there have been certainly indications that the Spanish P3 did engage in the same type of operations that Gelly did. So certainly, I mean, this would have been a very effective means of controlling various governments, and given the natural secrecies of a Masonic lodge in the first place, it would have provided kind of an ideal framework to work within to set up these
Mhm.
kind of operations.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the the blackmail scheme that was used in propaganda too. And this is something that we see just historically in secret societies. And today, we see it now through sexual blackmail, this same type of control. And we see, going back to the Bavarian Illuminati, they would require their members to give them a list of books and their enemies and, information that they could use against them. We see this in smaller cults as well, like Nexium. It's a tried and true tactic that seems to work for these scumbags. Um,
Yeah. And I
so
mean, in many ways, Nexium, Epstein, I mean, these are probably a continuation of the same types of processes that were sort of revealed with P2 in the 80s, the 90s. Certainly, I mean, I'm sure this is, Nexium and Epstein are hardly the only ones that are active in this day and age either. So,
mhm, right. Um, and another organization that you always seem to touch on in your work, you come back around to again and again, is Les Circle. It's Tell us what this organization is and how it's connected to the Bilderberg Group.
well, it began as kind of an offshoot of the Bilderberg Group in the period around 1952, 1953. And initially, its purpose was rapprochement between Germany and France. At this point in time, the US and the UK were trying to get the European Union up and running, and it was generally understood that the two cornerstones of this would be France and Germany. And of course, at the time, there was a bit of a bad blood between these two nations because of the two world wars and the Nazi occupation and so forth. So initially, it was kind of a way for the political leaders to hash out their differences. But unlike Bilderberg, it always had a much more reactionary bent to it, and obviously much more of an emphasis on Central Europe than Bilderberg, where a lot of the membership had really been dominated by the U.S. and the U.K. and the Netherlands and so forth, all of which were also Protestant countries. The Suklas really base power was in the Catholic countries of Europe, and as such, virtually all of the founders were connected either to the Knights of Malta or Opus Dei, which gave it a very fanatic Catholic characteristic for the first couple of decades. Now, going into the 70s, things changed a little bit. At this, I should point out too, also there were actually no American or British members of the Circle until the late 60s. That
Hmm.
probably played into some of the dispute that was going on with de Gaulle at the time. The Circle had initially been kind of a French initiative, and the French and the US and the UK on the other side were not having the best relations during the 60s, to put it mildly. De Gaulle was probably a little miffed about the multiple attempts the CIA had made to assassinate him during the early 60s. So, yeah. But anyway, after May of 68, they kind of buried the hatchet somewhat, and that led to the Americans initially being brought in. This would have been like David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger on the one side. But then going into the 70s, they started to bring in some Britons like Brian Crozier and Julian Amory, all of whom were prominent Tories. And eventually, the British essentially took over Le Cercle beginning in the 1980s. At that point, Brian Crozier became the chairman. And ever since then, pretty much every chairman has been British, probably a British Tory, if I'm not mistaken. So it's almost become, in a way, almost kind of a secret society within the Tory party in the UK, though certainly it still has a very much an international scope as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, in in Daniel Estulin book on the Bilderberg Group, he mentions that he believes the name could have come from uh, an organization that Himmler was putting together called the Circle of Friends of the Economy. Uh, do you is that where the name Le Cercle comes from?
Uh, I mean, I don't really know. There was another organization that was actually kind of founded around the same time by French intelligence that was also called the Circle of something or other. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I mean, it's not entirely beyond the stretch of possibility. Certainly, Himmler was a monarchist at heart, and he had been kind of associated with the conservative revolutionary elements in Germany in the years leading up to the war. The conservative revolution was more of an aristocratic faction of right wingers within Germany, as opposed to the Nazi Party, which tended to be much more populist in the early years. Uh, this group had eventually started to conspire with the US and the UK to remove Hitler beginning in the late 30s, early 40s, to various means. But certainly, it's definitely a possibility. Himmler was kind of within this sort of circle of German aristocrats who seem to have gravitated later on to Le Cercle. But like I said before, it was initially a French initiative more than anything else. I mean, I would kind of suspect that the French, especially at this time frame, may not have been very inclined to, take a name on from a
Hmm.
organization that was promoted by a very prominent Nazi.
Gotcha. Well, another figure who ties into Les Cercle, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong every time, but is this figure, Lord Lamont, and he also ties us back to Epstein and the Maxwells. Who is this figure?
Norman Lamont eventually became the chairman of the Cercle in 96 or 97. There's some dispute about that. And he was the chairman for quite a few years, at least till sometime between 2008 and 2010. But at the same time, Lamont had started to have regular contact with Robert Maxwell beginning in at least the late 1980s. His last meeting with Maxwell was in 1991 when Norman Lamont was the Chancellor of the Exchange, essentially Britain's equivalent to the Secretary of Treasury. It's also a very powerful post within the British government. During the 20th century, two other chancellors, Harold Macmillan and the prime minister at the time, Lamont was the chancellor. John Major had started out as the chancellor, and then they had become the prime minister. So it could be kind of a stepping stone to the prime ministership. It was a very crucial cabinet position. And even before then, Lamont had also been in some very, significant bodies, the Department of Trade and Industry, I think it was called, and then also the Ministry for Defense Procurements or something to that effect. But both of those were very closely related to arms sales. And in this capacity, that might have been why he had begun to meet with Maxwell in the late 80s. Of course, there's some speculation that this was in kind of a semi-official capacity as a representative of the British government under specifically Thatcher's government. Thatcher was herself very close to Maxwell. And kind of pulling things back a bit, this really goes into kind of the arms trade that was happening in the UK in the 1980s. When Thatcher came to power, she wanted to finally crush the unions once and for all, which would have been devastating to the industrial base in the UK. So they needed something to replace it with. And the answer to that was the arms industry. Under Thatcher, Britain became the second largest arms seller in the world, behind only the United States, and they're still way up there. And it had gotten to the point where I think something like 1 out of every 5 British citizens were engaged in the arms industry to some effect or other. So, in a lot of ways, the military industrial complex is even more pervasive in the United Kingdom than it is here in the States. Now, the Labour Party was also getting a cut of this action, which is probably why they kept quiet during this whole regime and essentially continued it after Tony Blair came to power in '97. And it seems like Robert Maxwell was essentially the guy who was handling the arms trade for labor. At the same token, you had on the other side of the coin the I think it was the Savoy Mafia. I'm not probably not pronouncing that properly, but it's Savoy, Savoy, Savy. I'm not sure exactly, but you can look it up on my website. This particular network featured her son, Mark Thatcher, and also another guy who eventually became a circular chairman, Jonathan Atkin. So my guess is that Lamont was probably having meetings with Maxwell going into the late 80s, early 90s in relation to the arms trade that was prevailing in Great Britain at the time, probably keeping tabs on what was going on his end of the thing. And then at the same token, Atkin also had ties to the Maxwell family. Specifically, he knew Kevin Maxwell, Robert Maxwell's son, who was the one who really took over managing the Maxwell empire after his father's death, to the point that Kevin was actually invited to Atkin's wedding in 2003. And ironically, Ghislaine might also know Jonathan Atkin as well. He was actually invited to one of her charity events in 2004, something to the Kit Kat Club. The Kit Kat Club, some kind of meeting they had in 2004. Atkin was present. I don't know if Elaine was or not, but it does seem like the Maxwells were sort of in this whole orbit with these circlet chairmen throughout the late 80s, going into the 90s and the early part of this current century. So it definitely makes for some kind of interesting speculation, especially when you look at the close ties both Maxwell's and the Circle have had to arms trafficking for many years now, especially the latter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating stuff. Um, I'd like to shift gears into our kind of last set of questions, uh, and there's another figure who uh, I saw was seems to have ties to Opus Dei and Le Cercle, and that's William Colby. Um, what was his connection to Le Cercle?
He had been a visitor to several of their meetings, I believe, in at least the 1970s. And at the same time, he was also involved with Opus Dei. And like the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei also seems to have been one of the organizations that was being used to set up the stay behind networks in Europe during this time frame. So it's quite possible that Colby was meeting with Le Cercle in this context, because again, as I've kind of started to get into in my blog, with Circler really seems to have been the kind of premier organization behind a lot of these stay behind networks. Certainly many of the founders were very closely tied to the stay behind networks within their respective nations, and Colby is a guy who had helped set them up and had worked in conjunction with Opus Dei in this capacity, would have been an obvious figure that Le Cercle would have probably wanted to coordinate with.
Mm-hmm. And now Colby is connected to something called the Phoenix program. Could you tell people just generally what was the Phoenix program?
The Phoenix program was effectively it was kind of a death squad, more or less. I mean, it was set up essentially to root out the Vietnamese opposition during the Vietnam War, and essentially this amounted to going into the field and killing and capturing as many suspected Vietnamese officials related to the Viet Cong as they could find. Of course, whether or not or how close the connections were is highly debatable. It was very brutal. I mean, something like 30,000 deaths are attributed to the Phoenix program. Uh, it was so controversial that essentially when the Bush 2 administration asked the CIA to set up a kind of global Phoenix program for the war on terror, they more or less refused, which is what led to the Joint Special Operations Command taking over this function. So now we essentially have a global Phoenix that's being run by our Special Operations Forces.
Hmm. Hmm. And this program is it's very interesting who else is connected to this program, because John DeCamp, uh, who people know this guy in the conspiracy world because he was the guy leading the charge in the Franklin scandal, trying to uncover the sexual abuse that was going on there. But he was working under William Colby uh, in the Phoenix program. Uh, what do you think of John DeCamp? Do you think these guys were actually kind of started to see how corrupt some of the system was and actually were trying to fight against it? Or is John DeCamp potentially controlled opposition?
I definitely think the camp was controlled opposition. I mean, enough, of the scandals surrounding Franklin, it kind of started to bubble to the surface, and then you had the, kind of concurrent scandal with Craig Spence that broke out in 1989, and I think this essentially created a climate where there was a realization that you needed to acknowledge some of this, and DeCamp was essentially selected to kind of engage in this limited hangout. But as you kind of indicated, I know in the email with was his name Paul Banaka? Is that how it's
Paul
pronounced?
Benassi is how I've heard it
Benassi.
pronounced.
I mean, some of the individuals that DeCamp brought up, obviously, to expose the Franklin scandal, were not necessarily the most credible individuals. Though, in fairness, I should kind of point out one of the big, problems with exposing these pedophile rings in the first place is the witnesses are usually not what society would consider to be credible because in many cases they're drug addicts. They have themselves also engaged in some degree of pedophilia, but none of this is really uncommon for people that have experienced sexual abuse as children. It's, for obvious reasons, incredibly traumatic, and many people, once they become adults, are very damaged because of this and they're not able to lead normal lives. But
Hmm.
in the case of DeCamp, to me, the really red flag is the fact that he almost completely ignored the connections to Boys Town, the Catholic school that had taken on a lot of orphans and whatnot, in his account of this. And Boys Town actually seems to have been the major source of children that were being procured by Lawrence King for this whole pedophile network here. The connection to Boys Town really didn't start to come out in earnest until Nick Bryant started to research this almost a decade later. As far as I'm aware, I think DeCamp had generally tried to steer people away from this. And then even some of the people that were kind of outed as being connected to this, like Roy Cohn and Robert Keith Gray, I'm guessing they might have been thrown to the wolves in part because in the case of Kuhn, he was dead by that point in time, or Cohn, by the case he was dead by that point in time, but also the fact that they were homosexuals essentially. There's definitely some indications by some of the other individuals, like Rothstein, I think, whoever the cop was, who might have been one of the camp sources from New York Police Department. So I'm guessing that there might have been a bit of I mean, some of these people were definitely, I would say, definitely in the camp of pretty hardline Christian conservatives, and they might have had a bit of an axe to grind with this kind of network of Republican homosexuals that was represented by Cohn and Gray and Craig Spence and some of these other individuals. So maybe there was some capacity where they were, or at least they thought that they were trying to expose corruption, but it seems like they kind of picked rather safe targets within their, particular faction to expose,
Hmm.
and generally, might have led to some loot or some. bad trails for researchers to follow. I mean, this definitely seems to be the case with Robert Keith Ray. I have looked into this guy a lot, and I have not. I mean, he might have been engaged in some kind of homosexual prostitution ring in D.C., but I really have not found a lot of compelling evidence that it involved, underage children or anything of that nature. So definitely, I do think there was a lot of disinformation presented by DeCamp in his account, and that was probably deliberate. We can always speculate in his motives. Was he doing it because he just didn't want to end up dead and he, could only expose certain individuals? Was he doing it to put a certain spin on it? There probably was a certain degree of truth to any number of the interpretations you could have for DeCamp and why he was doing what he was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another interesting figure that kind of ties into this, and this is what really made me like start questioning this whole story quite a bit, is it seems that Michael Aquino might have been a part of the Phoenix program. He was over in Vietnam around this time, and he was already working in military intelligence. Aquino specifically is known for propaganda and
Psychological warfare, yeah.
psychological. Exactly, that's what I was trying to think of. Thank you. And Aquino is named in numerous pedophilia cases, including the Franklin scandal. I believe Paul Benassi names Aquino as one of the abusers, and it's very interesting to see because Aquino becomes one of these key figures of the satanic panic, kind of a villainous figure, and DeCamp becomes kind of a heroic figure in this time, or painted that way at least. Do you think that these guys were actually all tied together at the Phoenix program?
I mean, it's possible. I don't think I've seen anything that I would consider to be credible that Aquino was involved in Phoenix, but he was a psychological warfare officer, and that falls under the purview of special operations. Of course, when we think of special operations, usually it's, something that's involved in paramilitary operations or assassinations or something to that effect. But black propaganda was also historically classified as being part of a special operation. And the reason being, all these things, black propaganda, covert activities in a country, assassinations, they're all essentially meant to undermine a regime within a hostile country. So a lot of times there is a close connection between them, and as such, the what is it, the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center, or whatever the heck it's called, that trains for a lot of this, psych war and stuff like that, is actually located in Fort Bragg, which is also the heart of the, special operations community as well. So there is a lot of overlap between psychological warfare and covert activities. This, connection has always existed, probably going back to the special operations executive, the British, kind of dirty tricks outfit from the Second World War. One of the components of the Special Operations Executive was the Psychological Warfare Executive, which handled this black propaganda. And these two entities often worked in close conjunction. You can see a similar relationship in France during the 1950s with the, what was it, the Fifth Army Psychological Bureau and their own special operations forces, the elite paratroopers and things of that nature. And then also, as I kind of just got to, with Fort Bragg. So it would be entirely possible that Aquino could have been involved in Phoenix. Certainly, I would imagine that psychological warfare was a component of the Phoenix program, and if he was stationed in Vietnam, he would have been, certainly a candidate for something like that. If that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it is unclear. We don't have any definitive evidence of how these guys might have been tied together. I just thought it was kind of interesting to see how they were all over in Vietnam, in kind of black operations at the same time.
Oh yeah,
You know, Now another more modern organization that it seems to me like controlled opposition is called the International Tribune for Natural Justice, and this is run by a guy named Robert David Steele, who says that he's an ex-CIA agent, and Sasha Stone, who has involvement in all sorts of weird kind of new agey uh, projects. Have you heard of this organization, and do you have any thoughts on it?
No, I have not. I was actually just kind of, looking at some of the material after I saw your email earlier today, and yeah, I mean, my initial impression was also that it was controlled opposition. I think the guy Steele had actually cited Buckminster Fuller or something like that as inspiration. Of course, Fuller had also had some kind of bizarre connection to the U.S. intelligence community, so that in and of itself is a bit of a
Hmm.
red flag in my book. But I mean, I don't want to pass judgment in this outfit, without really
Yeah.
knowing very much of anything about it. I've only, like I said, just kind of scrolled at a few things for about an hour beforehand. So,
Yeah. I mean, something that I noticed with them is that they use for their symbol a thyrsus, which is a symbol used by numerous fertility gods. Um, and I just, they're supposedly, all about fighting child sex trafficking. And that's one of the things that jumped out to me. Like, why are you using this symbol if you're trying to fight sex trafficking? I won't ask you to comment too much on a group that you don't know about. I would like to ask you, you're an effective researcher. Do you have any tips on how we can vet other researchers, important figures in current events and history? How do we determine the motivations of some of these individuals?
well, I just think, the best bet is just to try to, if you're interested in a specific topic, just try to get as many sources as you possibly can on the topic and, just compare and contrast notes and so forth. I mean, one of the guys I've kind of harped on, for instance, as being a guy who's potentially a disinformation agent was Gordon Thomas, who wrote Journey into Madness and the book on Robert Maxwell's Israeli super spy and so forth. But I mean, Thomas was a guy after reading Albarelia's work, H.P. Albarelia's work, who wrote A Terrible Mistake. I kind of realized that he had confabulated a lot of things related to MK Ultra and Artichoke and so forth. And you can determine that. I mean, some of his accusations on Journey into Madness are inaccurate just by going back and looking at some of the other research by John Marks and Martin A. Lee, who actually provide their source material. Gordon Thomas doesn't actually give any real references to a lot of the stuff that he claims in Journey into Madness. It's all, allegedly based on intelligence sources. And I don't have any doubt that he did have intelligence sources, but I'm guessing that he was probably being fed a certain degree of disinformation along with the actual genuine articles, and he either did not properly vet it or he had intentionally spread disinformation to potentially get even better revelations at a future date. This was, of course, something that kind of happened with the UFO researcher, Ronald Moore, something to that effect. But he had essentially come out in the late 80s, early 90s, and acknowledged that he had been fed a lot of stuff by the Air Force Office of Special Investigation that was disinformation. He knew it was disinformation. He had still spread it within the UFO community, and he did that in the hopes that he would eventually be given, the genuine article in terms of information on UFOs. And I'm guessing that this is a rather common practice. It's not just in the UFO field, but it's probably been used in a host of other arcane topics and so forth. So, I mean, that's something you really have to keep in mind. Even if a guy seems legitimate, he has, credible sources and so forth. Well, I mean, are these sources actually committed to exposing this or that? Are they simply trying to engage in some type of limited hangout, which is
Mhm.
often the case? So, just given my own kind of experience, I mean, talking to former intelligence officers, you definitely want to try to check everything that they tell you as thoroughly as you can, and be aware that there probably are inconsistencies in their statements.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that generally that's one of the most important things I've learned is you need to check everyone's sources. Because people, it's too easy to twist things out of context, uh, or misuse quotes. And so I would find just check everybody's sources, is the tip I would give. Now, I would. You have so many in-depth articles. You've done a lot of great research. I'd like to give you a chance here to highlight. Is there any articles that or series of articles that you're most proud of on your website?
I think the ones I would be most proud of were the ones on the Sovereign Order of St. John and Le Cercle, maybe to some extent the World Anti-Communist League and the American Security Council. Though some of those are maybe I probably could update them now with a lot of additional information if I have the time to. But I was definitely proud of these because I mean they highlighted a lot of organizations that really don't get a lot of attention in conspiracy circles and what have you. And that was really kind of my intention, was to try to open up a broader debate, to start getting people to look at these organizations on the right that, you know, have really been bypassed by a lot of more reputable, or I shouldn't say reputable, more well-known conspiracy theorists.
Right.
So definitely, you know, that was something I was very pleased with. And, you know, especially in the era of Trump, it kind of seems like finally more people are starting to take a look at some of these organizations. And I suppose I do feel a bit of pride maybe of being in, you know, a little earlier into some of these than other people had been.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've certainly brought up numerous organizations and really dug deep into them that other people really haven't touched. And so you've got some great, unique work. I would really encourage people to go check out the Visa blog after this video. Um, but I would like to also ask you, as my final wrap up question, is how do you think people should respond to this vast evil that exists in our world? What can the everyday person do in the face of all of this?
Well, I mean, that's definitely kind of the quagmire, isn't it? I mean, you know, we were
Mhm.
kind of started out this discussion with, you know, Richard Nixon, and I mean, his confrontation with the China lobby. Well, I mean, what exactly could Nixon have done? You know, it's a very complicated situation, and I don't know if I really have an easy answer to all of this. I mean, I think the best that we can all really try to do in our day-to-day lives is just try to engage in activities that are positive, that are not, you know, a part of exploitation, at least as much as possible. Of course, in the United States and the UK, and I mean a lot of other first world nations, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of occupations that you can go in that are not in some way linked to exploitive practices in some other part of the world. So, you know, I mean, I think really the best thing you can try to do is just minimalize what you're contributing to this exploitive system that we all toil under to some extent at all. I don't know if there's really a more I don't know if there's really a better answer at this point than that. I mean, obviously, there's so much controlled opposition out there. There's the question of who to believe. You know, you can just
Mhm.
keep trying to research things and try to live the most moral life that you possibly can under the circumstances that you're in. You know.
Right. Yeah, but it's not an easy question to answer. It's something I want to continue to try to dig into though on this podcast, is trying to figure out like how can we respond to all of this, and can we actually make a difference in the fight against it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I know what you're saying, and it's, you know, it's a question I would like to have a better answer to you, for you and your listeners as well. But I mean, frankly, I don't. You know, it's
Mhm.
definitely, I mean, a quagmire for me as well. I mean, what exactly can be done?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we can continue telling the truth and yeah, doing our best to live our live our lives well and not participate in their systems of corruption as best as we can. I think that's certainly something we can try to do. So thank you, Recluse, for coming on. It's been awesome talking to you. I'd love to do more talks with you in the future. Maybe we can do some more
Oh,
in
absolutely.
depth on specific topics next time if we can have you on again. Are there any big projects or articles or things you've got coming up?
Well, yeah, I've got two book projects that I've been working on. One of is the trauma project. Don't know exactly what Frank's decided to call the book now off the top of my head, but it's essentially a collaboration with Frank Zero that's essentially based around the concept of trauma and how it's been used by intelligence agencies to manipulate the populace and so forth. It was kind of, I guess, partly inspired by Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. So I contributed a couple of essays to that. One's going to deal with the Mellon family, one's going to deal with Colonia Dignidad, and the final one's going to deal with private military companies. So hopefully we're getting into the last, kind of stages of editing with that. I think they're down to my last essay, and then hopefully from there we're going to move forward with trying to get the book out. And then I also just started writing another book that's going to be called A Special Relationship, and that's actually going to chronicle a lot of the ties between Epstein and the, much older Perfumo affair, and kind of examine the family connections and what have you between these two scandals, which is something I'm definitely really excited about. I've already got the introduction finished. I'm starting to work on the first chapter, which has been going very well, and already making a lot of really incredible connections that I wasn't aware of when I started the project. So I definitely think it's going to be really a mind-blowing book, honestly, when I finally get it finished.
I am sure it will be. You do fantastic writing, and I definitely look forward to seeing those. I'm glad that you've committed to making some books, working on these bigger projects, because you definitely have the chops for it.
Thank you.
Well, awesome. Just to tell people what's going on with me, I've been working on a Masonic Origins of America series on my YouTube channel, so make sure to stay tuned in the coming weeks as we finish that series out. We're going real in depth with a lot of the important occultists who led up to the foundation of America, and so that's the big thing I've got going on. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll have a podcast feed started soon as well. And make sure to add to your bookmarks Recluse's website. It's viceupview.blogspot.com. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, everybody, go check out his articles. He does fantastic work. And I hope to see you all next time for our next Anti-Naughty interview. Everybody have a great day.